Thank you so much for that very warm introduction. First of all, I'd like to thank the Center for Equity and Human Rights for organizing this event and also for inviting me. A special thanks to Danica Bryson and also to Julianne for making my way here so easy and welcoming. Thank you very much. So today I'm going to be talking about racism in nursing. I should say that I'm not a nurse by profession. However, I'm a sociologist, and my specialization is actually in racism and racism in the workplace particularly. But I came into looking at nursing kind of by chance, and sort of developed a special sort of insight, I guess you could call it, with regard to systemic racism in nursing and how it works today. So I'd like to, because of the context of this morning's, this afternoon's event, I'd like to begin with some quotations around nursing students and their experiences in the clinical practice context. So this is one of my colleagues. Her name is Marl Jacobs. She's a professor in the Department of Equity Studies where I teach. Her background is that she used to be a psychiatric nurse for over 30 years in Toronto, and now she's a sociologist and a colleague, as I mentioned. And she has recently published a book called Women's Work, Racism Revisited, in that she quotes a student nurse from a CBC radio show on nurse bullying, which apparently aired in 2011, and I quote, I am currently in my last year of my BSc in nursing. As a nursing student, I have seen this many times, not only in staff on floor, but also in nursing instructors. It puts students in an extremely uncomfortable position when you're being bullied by the person who is in charge of whether you pass or fail that year of nursing. I remember clearly that out of a clinical group of 8, this instructor made 7 students cry. During my evaluation, very negative, derogatory, and unprofessional comments were said, yet not written. In her mind, students were being, quotes, babied by being told that they were doing properly in clinical. And this is a theme that I find is repeated, this issue of not babying nursing students. In another quote from the same Dr. Jacobs, she quotes a senior nurse with decades of nursing experience. Again, I quote, I have just hired 6 new graduate nurses, and I will be placing them on the units where there will be complaints that they have no skills and that the older nurses are not paid to teach them and will get angry at them. It seems that they like to destroy their confidence. At the end of my career, I can say that nurses, quotes, eat their young and are not the helping professionals to each other. A young nurse came to see me in tears as she had been shouted at in front of a group by a senior nurse because she could not catheterize a patient. The older nurse told her that she was paid as an RN, that she should act as one, and that she was, quotes, not here to baby you. So just to set the context, I thought that I would begin with those 2 narratives. I just want to talk a little bit about the general culture within nursing as an occupation. Hospitals and healthcare institutions have many hierarchies marked by power differentials and tensions emanating from these power differentials, which affect those working in it. There are tensions between nurses and doctors, which is a historical tension. And it is also very highly gendered because historically physicians were marked as a male profession, whereas nursing is marked as a female profession. So it's a very gendered kind of tension. There are also tensions between nurse managers and staff nurses. So between management and staff nurses. Staff nurses do not generally have input into decision-making processes which are made at the top. If nurses have complaints, these complaints are generally not investigated or followed through, in my experience, in my research, even in cases of abuse. Among the many tensions that are prevalent, we also have the tension between older and younger nurses, as I had, the narratives show. It seems that a non-helpful attitude is prevalent when it comes to new nurses, whether they are young, registered nurses, student nurses, or internationally educated nurses. And as a sociologist and a critical race scholar, it makes me ask the question, why is that? And is nursing the only profession? Obviously, I don't think nursing is the only profession where this happens. But I think that nursing as a profession brings together some unique kind of characteristics and issues that makes it particularly an environment in which all of these tensions can thrive, and also throwing racism in there. And you can imagine the complexity of the environment. So in general, in terms of answering the question, why is it? I tend to look at nursing as an occupation, as a very high-stress occupation. You're dealing with illness, death and dying, mental health issues and trauma. Family members of patients who are also coping with loved ones going through these very same experiences. It is emotionally, psychologically and physiologically charged. Within that context, it is also a service that is being given to these people who are ill and dying and experiencing other issues such as trauma and so on. And there is a low tolerance level for errors and risks. As we know that there's a College of Nursing which sort of looks after the interests of the public, the patients. So nursing scholars write about an environment in which nurses feel constantly monitored for errors being made, complaints being filed, and negative documentations arising out of it. This monitoring is done not only by nurse managers, but also by fellow nurses who may be on side with the managers. So some people have talked about lateral violence or horizontal violence. So it's, in other words, it's not only managers and staff nurses, but it's also between nurse colleagues. There is often more negative feedback given to nurses than positive we keep hearing about. And on top of that, nurses are overworked in an environment of funding cutbacks and never decreasing levels of work and increased levels of paperwork. And it is clear that from a labor perspective, it is a very intensive, work-intensive kind of occupation. And on top of that, we have a process of de-skilling going on of registered nurses, where RNs are being displaced, or there's always a threat of being displaced by lesser skilled and less costly workers, such as RPNs, registered professional nurses, or personal support workers, who happen to be predominantly women of color. Many who practice nursing in their country of origin, many internationally educated nurses who cannot afford the costs of re-registration opt to become personal support workers after a few months of training in community colleges. So, all these things add to the tensions between nurses. There are also tensions with patients. Patients and their family members make demands on nurses. They seem to have a sense of entitlement to do so as customers. And there's a culture of customers are never wrong in hospitals, and they're always being catered to by hospitals. So abuse from patients are not uncommon, including physical abuse. And just last week, you may have heard about this news that the Royal Ottawa Hospital, a mental health facility, was charged for not taking appropriate violence prevention measures when a patient attacked and injured several RNs at a nursing station. ONA, which is the Ontario Nurses Association president, Linda Haslam-Stroud, commented that this happens often, which had caused ONA to advocate for the inclusion of violence prevention as part of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. It took effect in June 15, 2010, so 4 years back, And this was the first time charges have been laid against a hospital. And in July 2013, ONA had called for the Ministry of Labor to take action against another hospital, but it didn't happen. This hospital was in Newmarket. So apart from all of these tensions that are listed here on the PowerPoint, I come back to the whole issue of racism, throw that into the mix. The workplace, as I have been sort of alluding to, is also racially charged. Most nursing managers are still white, even though there is a very high concentration of women of color in nursing, but generally in the lower levels and the middle levels. So there's sort of a segregation, a hierarchical, racially and spatially kind of segregated nursing population. So I just want to talk a little bit about what does racism look like today. I think that generally when we think of racism, we think of overt examples of racism where somebody's put down by the use of overt language or name calling or even physical assault and so on. But I think racism today is much more subtle than that, and that's what makes it very difficult to pinpoint and to have a case around. So I want to just give you a few narratives again, and I apologize that these have not been translated ahead of time because I just brought them with me. So I'll just read them. So the first narrative I quote, this is an employer speaking. Their facial expressions, their view on life, they look like they speak English, they sound like they speak English, but they don't speak English. The dominant form, so the colloquialisms, the verbal and non-verbal kind of expressions that go along, it sort of reminds me of an article which in which there was a discussion of speaking white. And I think that it was written by a French Canadian, who was told, can you speak white? In other words, speak English in the way that a person with a first language of English would be speaking. So from an equity perspective, this sort of attitude raises concerns about how this employer would evaluate a nurse of color or a nurse for whom English is not the first language. And I know that in terms of the evaluation of nurses, communication skills are very important. And it's never quite specifically defined what they mean by communication skills. And whenever there's a subjectivity involved in interpreting evaluation criteria, there's cause for concern. Now here's another quotation. This is by a black nurse who I interviewed. A couple of times, the family would ask if I'm the real nurse. And I told them, RN means real nurse. Something like that. Or I would say, they would think that I am sort of like the healthcare aide or assistant. They wouldn't think I was the person in charge. When I had a supervisory job, I think I shocked a few people because I think they wanted to complain about a nurse of color, and then they find out the nursing supervisors of color. Somehow they became quiet. They never lodged a complaint. So in this experience, what we find is that a real nurse is usually equated with a white nurse, and a white nurse who speaks English as a first language. So there's a kind of a culture of whiteness which privileges white skin. And so if there's a white nurse, then there's an assumption that they are the real nurse, and they are good nurses. They have good skills. Whereas if you are a black nurse or a nurse of color, the opposite is true. The assumption is that you are not a good nurse. You somehow are lacking, unless you can prove that you have assimilated into that culture of whiteness. So, and also whiteness is associated with being a real nurse. Anyway, that's what I was talking about. So even a black nurse who is in charge often finds herself being discounted because of the fact that she's black or a nurse of color. The next quotation is similar. Quotes, "This surgeon is very controlling to most of us, but it seems he has a particular grudge in me. For example, if he's giving instructions to us, two nurses, RN, that's me, and the other one, who is an RPN, he discusses the instructions with the RPN, who is white, instead of me, even though I was in charge of care that day, since I'm the RN." So again, who is the real nurse? You know, the doctor is giving the instructions to a nurse who is lower than her in terms of nursing status, but she happens to be white, therefore the doctor, and the doctor doesn't necessarily have to be white, the doctor could be non-white as well, you know, but there's an assumption about who is the real nurse. The next two quotations are from nurses who were internationally educated nurses, and after they came to Canada, they got re-registered and licensed. And they're talking about how they found jobs only because somebody on the inside recommended their name. So they're raising questions as to why that is, because this one particular nurse talks about how she had made, you know, scores of applications to that same hospital, but she never got an interview with them. But it was only when somebody from the inside recommended her, that's when she got the job. So this raises concerns from an equity perspective in terms of word of mouth hiring, which is an example of systemic discrimination. So only people who know people on the inside would be able to get information about openings in the hospital. And the final narrative that I have talks about the requirement of Canadian experience, which is again a very common demand. And it's particularly difficult for immigrant nurses who've been trained outside. How am I doing for time?
Oh, take your time.
Yeah, I have time, okay. So what I want to say is that the discourse or language used today to refer to one's race is coded. There is no direct reference to one's racial category or physical characteristics. In the examples that I gave you, the discourses are of not having language skills, not having Canadian experience, not being a real nurse, or not having the real skills or being a good nurse. This is because given various human rights codes and policies that prohibit overt racism, the older language of biological essentialist racism is unacceptable today, although that still happens, but it's few and far between. Some scholars have described today's racism as new racism, or Francis Henry calls it a democratic racism because it allows democratic principles to coexist with racism. Or in other words, there's a contradiction between policy and practice. We may have human rights policies, anti-racism policies, anti-harassment policies, but in practice, there's a different story to be told. So there's a contradiction, and Francis Henry calls that democratic racism, but it has also been called new racism or neo-racism by others. And as I was mentioning, it is difficult to prove this kind of racism in a court of law, which often looks for motive, witnesses, and evidence of overt old-style racism. And when I did my research, I looked at arbitration reports. What I found is that almost all of them, I think there was only one case where the nurse won her case of racial discrimination because it was pretty overt and it was documented. But most of the other, or all of the other cases were dismissed because the chair and the committee members were really looking for overt signs of racism, and you don't have that today. It's very difficult to find that. So when a nurse of color brings a charge of racial harassment, there is the assumption is that it's not real, that she's too sensitive, that she's playing the race card, that she has a chip on her shoulder, she's too sensitive, or that she's just not a good nurse and she's trying to cover it up by bringing in the issue of racism. It's kind of, I like to always compare it to experiences of sexual harassment, where often the woman will be questioned about her experience, where she's re-victimized. So the same sort of thing happens today when, in cases of racial harassment, when the racism is very systemic and subtle. And so what I found in my research that I did a few years back, nurses of color often don't file grievances. They don't complain because they find that it's not, they don't win, you know, it's not followed up and so on. So, which is a very bad sign because it shows that people are not bringing forward cases, you know, they're just, there's kind of an apathy there, I guess, and they're losing faith in the systems that we have. And one of the things that we have learned, of course, is that racism intent and intention and motives are not necessary for the existence of racism. And it is really the end result of practices and policies which show that there's systemic racism. Systemic racism operates when apparently neutral or normal practices, procedures, and policies create a disadvantage for differentially racialized people. So I just wanted to mention the Northwest General Hospital case, which is how I became involved in looking at racism in nursing. In 1994, there was a very high-profile case that was taken up by the Ontario Human Rights Commission involving 7 nurses of color who worked all at the same hospital. It was the Northwestern General Hospital in Toronto, and it doesn't exist anymore, so I can talk freely about the case. Basically, all of these nurses brought forward cases of racial harassment. They had all been either fired or forced to quit. And they charged racial harassment against the hospital and also against their managers. And that's when I was brought in to kind of explain how this subtle kind of racism was happening. And, those nurses won their case after about 4 years of a very public case. And since that time, there have been many cases of that type that Ontario Nurses Association brought forward, and I was involved in some of them. And what you find is that after a while you see patterns in all of the cases. The pattern is like this, that all these nurses were doing fine. They were actually very good professional nurses with good evaluations and good track record until some change happens. For instance, a new nurse manager comes in who has a different style, or the hospital goes through restructuring and there's a layoff. So these are the times when these nurses of color, particularly the ones who are very outspoken or ones who have leadership potential to become a supervisor or nurse manager, they are the ones who are targeted for differential treatment, and they're basically set up to fail. A case is kind of built around them so that they will be proved to be incompetent nurses. And so there's no discourse of racism there. It's a discourse of individual pathology or a discourse of individual incompetence as a nurse. And a file is built up around her. And all of a sudden, you know, there will be documentation being put together because of very trivial things like being late for 5 minutes or leaving 5 minutes early or not signing off on medications. And she being called on practices which white nurses do without any reprisals or any documentation, but she's being managed in a different way, and she's been documented until she's proved incompetent, and somehow, you know, and then she's reported to the College of Nurses as a nurse who's not doing her job well. Another interesting thing that I found is that many of these nurses of color are allocated to the heaviest sorts of jobs in the hospital. So there is, again, allocation of jobs is very racialized. And so many of them get injured. And once they're injured or disabled, they're not accommodated. Their request for accommodation is not honored. And they are questioned in terms of whether they are really disabled or not. they're questioned about whether they're making up their disability. And so when they're not being accommodated, they are not able to do their job properly, and again they're being documented for being incompetent or missing work because of sickness or disability. So these are the kinds of patterns that I kept seeing, both of course in the case of Northwest General Hospital, but also in other cases that came around. So in my book, Real Nurses and Others, I sort of gave a name to these kinds of patterns. And I think this one kind of lists these behaviors of nurse managers: targeting, scapegoating, excessive monitoring, marginalization, dispersion, infantilization, blaming the victim, bias in work allocation, underemployment, denial of promotions, lack of accommodation, segregation, co-optation, selective alliances, and tokenism. So these are the kinds of practices that I identified within Northwest General Hospital, and through everyday incidents, through very small, minute interactions between a nurse of color and other colleagues or her manager. And but what is also important to do is to see that the behaviors are actually supported by the institution. So that's when it becomes systemic, because otherwise it stays at the realm of individual managers, being bad managers or whatever it is. So I think I'll end by just telling you that in 2000 I did do a research in collaboration with the Ontario Nurses Association. And one of the things that I did is, I did a number of things. As I was mentioning, I looked at their arbitration reports and things like that. But I also did a little survey of their members. Now, at that time, they had 40,000 members, and a survey was sent out, and 593 nurses responded, which is like a drop in the bucket if you think of 40,000 members, but it's also, in terms of sheer numbers, it's fairly large, and as far as I know, it's the largest survey that has been done with nurses, only in Ontario. So most of the nurses who responded were white, 52.4% were white, 10.5% were black, 10.1% were Asians, 3% were South Asians. There was one Aboriginal nurse. I didn't use hers to maintain her anonymity. 20.6% ticked off the other category, and I think most of them were people of mixed racial and ethnic heritage. 96% were female, about 3% were male, and about 1% gender not identified. So some of the highlights of the research findings were quite revealing. So for instance, one of the questions that I asked them was that, have you ever been made to feel uncomfortable because of your race, color, or ethnicity? And about 41% replied yes to that question, which is a very high number. And also when we did some analysis of how nurses of color answered this question, we found that most of them said yes. So about 82% of black nurses said yes, that they had been made to feel uncomfortable because of their race or color or ethnicity. 80% of Asian nurses said that same, 50% of South Asian nurses, 57% of Central and South American nurses, and compared to 25% of white nurses who also answered yes to this question. And another similar question I asked them was that, have you ever felt put down, insulted, or degraded because of your race, color, or ethnicity? And the answers were about the same. So again, most of the nurses of color said that they had been, felt put down. Another question that we asked was, have you ever witnessed an incident where a nurse was treated differently because of her race, color, ethnicity? 44% of all nurses said yes, they had witnessed an incident. 43% replied no. So about half of the nurses said that they had. So this kind of shows that it's pretty rampant. Everyday racism is pretty rampant. Another thing that was sort of surprising was that the largest proportion of put-downs were experienced from colleagues. And that was surprising because, I thought that it would be patients or managers or doctors, but it turned out to be colleagues. And this was of concern for the union itself, because colleagues are union members, right? Like you're supposed to be part of the same bargaining unit. I also asked them questions about working relationships, about systemic issues like if they thought race was part of their hiring or the kind of jobs they got and so on. A number of different areas where I was trying to look at systemic racism. And again, most of the nurses said no, I should say, in terms of numerical figures. However, those who answered yes, what we found is that most of the nurses of color were saying yes, that race did have something to do with how they related to their managers, their patients, other nurses, how they got hired, how, the kind of opportunities they had, and so on. So I think I'll leave it there. Basically, I used a number of different methodologies to demonstrate that racism is very much an issue in the work culture of nursing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Das Gupta.